top of the hour, so we will officially start the Red and Rural webinar series final episode number 3 on transformational conversations. My name is Raquel, and I am so glad that everyone could join us today. Before I hand it off to Ashton, I will just set a few group norms for all of us today on the webinar. So first things first, I want everyone to know that this webinar is being recorded. That way we can all come back and relearn this wonderful stuff, but just wanted everyone to be aware of that. If you want a copy of the recording or any other materials from tonight's training, please put yes in all caps in the chat box. That way we know to send it to you. Second, everyone is good with their videos off. That way we can all focus on what's going on today, and we will have a chance for folks to participate. Don't worry about touching any buttons. We will handle all of that, but we encourage you to take the time to transition to a quiet space, or maybe turn down the background noise if you want to participate in our discussion for this evening, which I think you totally will. Also, a quick note just about technology limitations. Some of us might be using the phone, and so the experience will be different than those of us using the Zoom app or joining from a desktop computer. I encourage all of us who are using the Zoom app and the computer to really participate in all the polls so we can have a nice, robust discussion for those of us who can unfortunately only listen in. And lastly, if you have a question, if you have a question at any time during this webinar, please write the word question in all caps before your question that you type out in the chat box. And that way our tech team can easily grab your question from the chat box, and we will answer it later in the evening towards the end of the webinar during a question and answer section. So thank you again so much for joining us. Please introduce yourself in the chat box by typing your name, your indivisible group, if you have one, and where you are calling from today. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Afton to get us started.
All right. Hi, y'all. I am Afton. I'm the Senior Regional Organizer for Tennessee and Kentucky for National Indivisible. And I supported the creation of the Raucous Rural Caucus and the National Rural Program, along with the Tennessee rural groups. I'm calling in from my phone because I am in a rural community in East Tennessee and I have no broadband. So as all of you, I'm sure there are a few of you in the same situation. So I just wanted to pause for, at this moment in time, I wanted to say thank you to all of your rural communities that are showing up. And not just in this conversation, but for showing up for Black Lives this past week. Raquel, if we can go to the next slide. Your advocacy in small towns really matters, especially when showing up to denounce racism and police violence. If you're on your phone or you are on your desktop, you should see a slide right now. These are major headlines from major papers highlighting the work that all of you are doing across the country to confront the narrative of rural communities in this country. So what you'll learn tonight will hopefully add and support to your efforts in building relationships after these protests, and to work to build multiracial and multi-class coalitions ahead of the 2020 elections. So in so much gratitude to all of you for showing up. We just appreciate you, and hopefully this will add to your toolkit. And with that, I'll pass it back to Raquel.
Thanks, Afton. I'm Raquel Jackson-Stone. I am a Senior Training Associate for Indivisible. I usually work with the Midwest, but during this wonderful time, I get to work with everybody because everyone is remote. Very excited to have you here today for our final Red and Rural webinar. I'm very glad you can join us, because I think this topic is really important now more than ever. We're talking about transformational conversations. Now, what we mean by transformational conversations, I'm actually wondering if y'all kind of know what we mean. Put into the chat box, if you don't mind, what you thought we were going to be doing today when you saw transformational conversations as the topic for this training? I'm pulling up my chat box so I can read your responses. What did y'all think the training on transformational conversations would actually look like today? How to break out of urban bubbles to reach out to rural voters. Awesome. Difficult conversations with others whose views are different. Definitely, definitely. Calling out racists in a nice way. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's definitely in a nutshell what we're talking about. So I'm glad that we're all here for the same thing. We like to think of them as those really difficult conversations with those that you love or those you just know. Maybe they're in your network or in your indivisible group maybe, or another organizing space, where you find an opportunity to change someone's perspective on an issue or a political opinion by really listening to them and building a connection with them. Now, there's no magic formula, you know, there's no sentence that will make something click for someone. To really move people, we have to listen to them with compassion and empathy, and really ask questions that allow them to reveal something they care about deeply or what the root of their concern is. This is how we bring people into the movement in a meaningful way, even if they don't disagree with us. To some of you, this may sound like deep canvassing, and you're definitely not wrong. Our guests today, Emily, Will, and Lizzie from the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, will share with us how they have been able to transform communities through deep canvassing. Will and Lizzie will share some stories about what it's like being a canvasser, deep canvassing in rural communities on a hot button issue like immigration. But now, before I give them the floor, we'd like to learn a little bit more about who's on the call by taking a poll. And so I will hand it over to Afton.
All right. I know it's everyone's favorite time of the evening, especially if you've participated in 2 webinars. So if we move to the next slide, we are going to take a poll to learn about who is on the call today.
Afton, you are cutting up so bad.
Show up on your screen, and if you're using a Zoom app or on your mobile phone. So once again, all right, there we go. Can you hear me?
Is it a little bit, yeah, better now?
Okay, great. All right, and we're back in action. Once again, rural broadband, ladies and gents. All right, so we're going to start this call by taking some polls. We'd like to hear who's on the call. And once again, if you're using the app on your phone or your desktop, you should be able to see the poll pop right up. So the first question, and if we could go ahead and, it's up? Okay, great. So how did you learn about this training tonight? Was it A, through the Raucous Rural Caucus? Was it B, through Indivisible's email? Was it C, through Indivisible's Facebook? Was it D, through a Medium post? Or E, other? So go ahead and take the first question. How did you learn about this training tonight? We want to hear from you. Question number 2, how involved are, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, it looks like most folks heard about it from the Indivisible email. But I'll let you keep going with questions.
Okay, great. And second question, how involved are you, if at all, with your Indivisible group? Are you a group leader? Are you a group member? Or C, do you only follow us on email and Facebook? Or D, other? Raquel, what are the results saying?
So it looks like we're a pretty mixed group. Seems like group members slightly outlead the group leaders, and there are a pretty significant amount of folks who are Facebook or email only, and a lot of others. We got a pretty mixed group today. All right, I'm very excited about this.
All right, third question. So did you attend the Red and Rural webinar number 1 and number 2? Did you attend both? A, yes, both. B, only number one, C, only number two, D, this is my first call. Very exciting. Raquel, what are the results saying?
So it looks like there are 5 people who have been here for the entire series. So thank you so much. I hope this has been as much fun for you as it has been for me. We got about 2 people who came to number 1. Glad that you came back. And looks like 8 folks who came back from number 2. Glad that you returned. And we have about 70 people that this is their first call. You know what? The end is not a bad place to start. I'm so glad that y'all are here.
Raquel and I are really excited. We've been doing this for 3 months, so welcome. We're super excited you're here. All right, question number 4. My A. All right, and we're back. Yes, thank you. All right. So are you coming to Indivisible Nationals Rural Summit? A, yes. B, no. C, maybe. D, what is the Rural Summit? Raquel, what are the results saying?
Well, it looks like there's about a tie for the folks who know about the summit, but there are a lot of folks who don't know what the summit is. Could you give us a quick little shout out, Afton, about what the Rural Summit is? Oh no, looks like we're still having more difficulties. So in the meantime, till Afton hops back on, I'm going to tell you.
National Rural 77, and guess who the headliner is? Still to come. But let's go ahead and move to question number 5, like in your rural community.
So politics in the rural community. Afton broke up a little bit, but comedian Trey Crowder is going to be hosting the Rural Summit, and we will talk more about that at the end of the call. So politics of the rural communities that folks live in. Looks like a lot of folks are deep red, followed by light red and a decent amount of purple. So seems like y'all are definitely in the right place to learn how to help move your communities more towards the purple side, or maybe even light red.
Raquel, why don't you go ahead and take the last 2 questions?
No problem, Afton. And so number 6 is, have you ever had a conversation with someone that made you change the way you thought about the world? We actually have a lot of people who answered yes, and I would love to hear some responses from folks. I'm wondering if anyone wants to raise their hand. Again, for folks using the Zoom app and on the desktop, it will be in the bottom black bar. You have an option to raise your hand. If folks want to share about what that conversation was like, what that experience was like, I'd love to share. All right, it looks like we have Susan Lyon. Susan, are you on?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'll just say when I was a young person in my 20s, I was visiting Rome, and my friend, who was very religious, also lived there. She was my host. And I was telling her how excited I was to meet or see the Pope. I was just thrilled. I thought, oh, this is fantastic. And she had told me, even though she was probably the most spiritual person I'd ever met, she told me she doesn't really do that. And I was stunned. And I said, well, why not? And she said, well, it's all castles and glitter and gold. And if you think about it, Jesus never had, he just had like basically simple clothes and sandals. And he didn't have an army. He didn't have all these luxuries. And it just stopped me in my tracks to everything I had thought about up to then. And that totally changed. It's odd, but that changed my entire worldview, and worldview on just so many different things, just that one conversation.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, it can be something very, very simple and really unexpected. We'll take one more person. Looks like Liz McGee. Liz, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, this is Liz McGahey. I live in Norris, Tennessee. I had an interesting experience about 2 years ago when we live in a town of, our Indivisible group is in a town of about 1,400, and in order to get the key to the community building and to have our Indivisible meeting, we have to go to the police station to pick up the key, which I did. And the police chief was there, and he said, well, so tell me about Indivisible, which I did. And I framed it. What I've learned in this area is not to frame it to begin with as anti-Trump, but as a pro-democracy group. But anyway, we got into a conversation, and he said, well, I appreciate where you're coming from, but I'm like Trump. And I said, well, tell me what you like about Trump. So, and his thoughts were about immigration, probably wouldn't be surprised, but it was a very enlightening conversation, and very cordial on both our parts, where we learned a little bit about, I learned where he was coming from and he learned where I was coming from, and we left, I don't think we changed anybody's mind, but we opened up the conversation to each other. And that was important to me, to have that conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing. It sounds like you're starting to do the work that we're actually going to be talking about tonight. So this is the exact perfect place for you to be. I'm so happy. And so last question before we hand it off to our guests. Is your rural community responding to what's happening nationally? And also I'd like to offer this chance for folks to raise their hands to respond. Also totally respect and hold space for folks who don't want to share, since this is a very, very, very emotional time. So we have some folks raising their hands. I will go to Chloe Moore. Again, I apologize if I get your name wrong.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, yeah. I heard about this Zoom meeting through the Indivisible email. I don't have a group or anything. I actually didn't even know anything about it until I started going on Twitter and finding out stuff. But I've found that there is an organization here in Phoenix that is downtown protesting, but there is no Black Lives Matter chapter out here. I've been trying to figure out how to get that out here, but I've just found that it's really, really, really hard to have a good conversation with anybody who sees opposing sides to this, and it's really hard to talk to anybody that isn't on the side of like, okay, are you against people being shot and killed in the streets, or are you not? And it's like, there's so much evidence, there's so much history, and there's like so much hypocrisy in what they're trying to talk back that I find myself just rage quitting most of the time. And I want to be helpful, but I almost feel like, how can I, when there's so many other voices that are just shooting down the voice that needs to be heard.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that's a struggle and frustration that we're all going through. This is really hard work. Changing the world is really, really hard work and takes a lot of difficult conversations and a lot of emotional energy from us, especially for this approach we're about to talk about today. I would love to get more people to participate, but unfortunately we are running behind time. So I am going to transition now. Thank you all who raised their hands, and I again apologize that I cannot capture everyone. Feel free to type in the chat box. But for right now, I am going to actually ask you not to type in the chat box, because we are going to transition to our guests, and I want them to have your full attention. I am very excited to introduce our presenters today. And like we talked about before this, and like we just talked about through those stories, these transformational conversations look a lot like deep canvassing. And this is a big part of Indivisible's theory of change. If we can connect with someone on an emotional level, or if we can connect with someone at some point who's like posting racist things and can at least get them to stop posting racist things at all, like that's a success. We can't expect to move people all across the spectrum, but just those conversations that move the ball a little bit is really what we're looking for. And I won't spill too many of the beans because Emily, Will, and Lizzie are going to share conversations about how their work doing deep canvassing in rural communities on immigration did exactly that, actually moved people and created shifts. So without further ado, I now give my screen over to Emily to take over the presentation. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Raquel. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Let me just share my screen and we will get started. All right. Can everybody see my screen? Cool.
Yep.
All right, my name is Emily Baird-Chrisohon, and I'm the Welcoming Tennessee Coordinator with the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, or as we're better known as TIRC, because who wants to say Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition all the time? My role focuses on creating a more positive space to discuss immigration and helping shift the overall narrative to be more pro-immigrant. So I work with a lot of conservative communities, looking to find points of connection and engagement to hopefully move people to be more pro-immigrant. And I oversee our deep canvassing work at TIRC, which has led to the development of the Transformational Conversations program. So TIRC is a statewide immigrant and refugee-led collaboration whose mission is to empower immigrants and refugees throughout Tennessee to develop a unified voice, defend their rights, and create an atmosphere in which they are recognized as positive contributors to the state. And this project is part of the Welcoming Tennessee initiative, which is an initiative that I oversee. And this initiative seeks to create spaces for more positive conversations about immigration and, again, to help shift this overall narrative. And before I forget, I want to say something to what Raquel said, that I completely agree that, you know, we have to think about the little victories that we have, right? And so I spend a lot of time working with people who are already supportive. I spend a lot of time working with people who are not at all. And sometimes if I'm working with someone who it isn't at a point where they're going to move fully to be pro-immigrant, what I want to do is complicate the issue for them. So if I can't move them, if I can complicate it for them, then that's a win, right? And so when we're thinking about having these conversations, we want to think about how we're moving some people incrementally. Some people are moving, you know, at a faster pace, but some people are moving at a slower pace, and that is still a win. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk about what makes deep canvassing successful, results from our deep canvassing immigration messaging project, and then how to apply those deep canvassing skills to your everyday life. So don't worry if you already know about deep canvassing. That is not the majority of our presentation today. We're just going to talk about how the deep canvassing tactics can work in our own lives to have transformative conversations. So we're not going to be as focused on the methods of deep canvassing. So don't worry, don't get off the call if you don't want to hear about deep canvassing, because we're definitely going to talk about how this can apply to you. So across the country, I don't think this comes as any surprise to anyone that people in power are using racism, xenophobia, and fear of undocumented immigrants to win their elections and ignite their supporters. This fear-based messaging is so effective that most of the time we lose those people who are conflicted. On the slide, you can see some of the headlines and tactics used to sway people based on fear and misinformation. And fear is a really powerful emotion. It's difficult to combat. So we need to find an equally strong way of engaging people's better instincts and desires. And I want to say that today I'm going to be talking about our project around immigration, because that is the area that I work most in. But I think that these conversations are absolutely relevant to other movements, and particularly to Black Lives Matter movement right now, which is so relevant. And so we're going to be talking about immigration, but you don't have to limit these conversations to immigration. So what we know is that combating fear with facts doesn't work. I really wish it did. I wish that I could hand someone a fact sheet about immigration and that they would become more supportive. But that's just not how people work. We make decisions based on our emotions. So in order to affect decision making, we have to tap into that emotion rather than the logic. The conversational methods of deep canvassing do this better than most strategies I've seen. So what exactly is deep canvassing if you're not familiar? I'm sure a lot of you may be familiar with GOTV canvassing, but might not be as familiar with deep canvassing. So instead of garnering support for a policy or candidate like GOTV canvassing does, deep canvassing seeks to understand someone's overall view on an issue, so for us, immigration. And rather than spending 3 minutes at someone's door, you're spending 10 to 20 minutes. It's like having a relational one-on-one with someone at their door. So we're hoping to learn from voters about how they feel, and we're also hoping that by giving voters space to process their concerns in a non-judgmental space, that we can move them to have more supportive views. This method of engaging voters is particularly helpful in rural and more conservative areas because it seeks to engage and learn from the voter, and it's a two-way interaction rather than a one-way talking at. So we deep canvassed in rural and suburban and conservative areas, the areas that a lot of y'all are living in, and with great success. And I'll get to more of that later, but I think that this way of conversation is really relevant to a lot of y'all that are on the call today. So what makes deep canvassing so effective? There are several components that we have in deep canvassing, but there are a few that we think are instrumental to its success. And this will be the story, the power of story sharing, the value of compassion, and the act of being heard. So my canvassers hear me harp on this all the time, and Will and Lizzie are probably laughing when I bring it up, but I really believe that the radical act of being heard is central to a successful conversation. And I say radical because to be truly heard and seen in a non-judgmental space is really radical. If you try to think of the last time that happened to you, it might be difficult. We actually want people to voice their concerns when we're talking to them. It's the only way for people to be able to move beyond those concerns. And to be met with a non-judgmental attitude is disarming. Something that's really important to remember is that to express an understanding of what the voter is saying is not to confirm their beliefs. This is really important and really difficult thing to do. It's not always easy at first, and it's challenging for a lot of our canvassers, but you can reflectively show that you've listened and that you understand the thoughts of a person you're speaking with without agreeing or confirming what they're saying. In fact, we don't want to agree or confirm some anti-immigrant thoughts, right? Helpful phrases to show this active listening are, so I hear you're saying blank, or it seems like blank is really important to you, or blank seems to be something you're really concerned about. So this is the type of way that we're showing someone that we're hearing their point of view, but we're not confirming that opinion. And when you get to the place of being able to share your own story, the person will be much more likely to listen to it. So a lot of times people are intimidated to enter into these conversations because they feel that they don't know enough about the topic at hand. But you don't have to be a policy expert to be successful in these conversations. In fact, I think sometimes maybe it's better if you're not. Movement doesn't require a sophisticated understanding of the issue at hand or a perfect set of talking points. There's no magical phrase that will move people. Instead, sharing your personal story or the story of a loved one while listening to the story of a person with whom you're speaking with is a lot more effective. And this requires a lot of bravery. We understand that. We have to be willing to mirror the vulnerability we want to receive. And the next really important piece to deep canvassing is this value of compassion. And we're going to talk more about how we arrived at that value of compassion in the script a little later on. But first, I wanted to take a moment to demonstrate what types of stories our canvassers are telling and asking voters to engage in. So we're going to do a quick little activity right now. I want all of you to think about a time when somebody showed you compassion when you really needed it. So this isn't a time when you showed someone compassion, it's when you were shown compassion. And usually the story would be a little longer, but since we don't have a lot of time tonight, I'm going to ask us to think of the one word that describes that experience for you, that receiving of compassion. And I'm going to model what I'm asking for, and then we're going to ask a couple of people to share their story. So the story that I would choose, the word that I would choose is listening. And the reason I would pick the word listening is that I have a chronic condition called POTS, and it took me about 5 years to get diagnosed. I went to doctor after doctor after doctor with no answers, just being told there was nothing wrong. And this was obviously a really, really hard time for me, and a time when I felt very vulnerable. And when I finally was diagnosed and saw the doctor that helped diagnose me, when I walked into his room, he said, "I'm so sorry for what you've been going through, and we can help you." And he listened to me in a way that a lot of people in the medical community had not up until then. And so that is why I choose listening to be the word that I think of when I think about my compassion story. So I'd love it if a couple of people could maybe raise their hands who would also like to share their compassion story with us. Okay, it looks like we have Jim on the line. Jim, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Jim. Would love to hear your story.
Well, I'm a survivor of the campfire in Paradise. And I don't know if everyone knows, but the campfire burned the entire town of Paradise down. And it was one of the worst fires in California's history.
Wow.
And in that, all of us that fled the fire, which there were only few that passed away from the fire, all of us that fled into the neighboring towns such as Chico, California. And what Chico, California did was open their arms to all of us and brought us in as though we were part of their family. So I would say support was my word, because Chico grew by 10,000 people overnight from just our town alone. And you can imagine what that does to services and in the influx in traffic, gas stations, the whole works. And yet they didn't shy away, nothing like that. They took us all in all at one time. So that's what I would say is support.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that story, Jim. That's really, really wonderful. Do we have another person that would like to share? I think I
Yep.
see Richard. Richard, can you hear me? Richard, are you there? It looks like you might be muted.
Now, can you hear me?
Oh, we can. We'd love to hear your story.
My youngest son battled his bipolar. And during snowpocalypse here in Frederick, Maryland, where everything was shut down for an unprecedented snowstorm, he went to Motel 6 and he called and talked to me, and he called and talked to his brother, and he called the young lady he was trying to get to come join him at the motel. He took an overdose of OxyContin and crack cocaine and passed in his sleep. I had a police officer knock on the door the next evening to let me know. I was working in food service for tips and minimum wage. I had no money. I was struggling as it was. The state police were going to take the body, and he would have ended up in a pauper's grave. I have a friend who is the owner of Rest Haven Memorial Gardens, which is a cemetery just north of Frederick. He stepped in and donated cremation services and a burial plot for my son. My son now rests in that memorial garden. I was able to bury him with the vial of his mother, who had passed beforehand, whose best friend gave me that to bury with Matthew. And a few years ago, I was able to forward a stone, and there's now a stone on top of the grave with his name and his mother's name that I can go visit on specific occasions. I would never have been able to do for Matthew what what Richard and Jill did for me, and I'll never be able to pay that back.
Wow. Richard, thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing that really powerful story. We really appreciate that. And I mean, that is the kind of vulnerability that really touches people and that we're really looking, to have with people. And I'm so sorry for what you went through, but I'm so sorry that there were people there for you in that time. So thank you so much for sharing that really powerful story. And I'm just so thankful that you had people supporting you through it. I would love to hear everyone's story on here, but we don't have time for it, unfortunately. So we're going to move on. But I'm so touched by both of those stories that were told, and just very, very grateful for that. Thank you. So how do we know deep canvassing works? We were able to participate in a project in 2018 that sought to understand if deep canvassing could move conflicted voters on immigration. This experiment involved 2 other cities in California and a research team. So the research team conducted pre and post surveys that voters were unaware were connected to the canvassing. So who are we wanting to talk to in these conversations? I kind of touched on it earlier, but we're really looking to speak with conflicted audiences. So these are people who might not be vehemently opposed to pro-immigrant causes, but hold mixed feelings about undocumented individuals. We're also looking to move people on both the policy and prejudice issues. So we want to move someone on the policy concern, but we also want to move their prejudice, right? We want to move the bias. And then we're looking to speak to more moderate or conservative voters. So when picking a district, we're looking for places where people voted for Trump, around 45 to 65%. So we're knocking in precincts where voters really need to be won over. So in Tennessee, we knocked on 3,304 doors and had 852 conversations. And in combination with the 2 other cities, we showed for the first time that deep canvassing can move voters on immigration in statistically significant amounts, and that those results are lasting. So on policy issues, we moved voters at a rate of about 8%, and on bias, it was about 5%. So when you think of how closely elections are won and lost, this is a hugely significant number. We also found that these results are lasting a year later. So that deep canvassing inoculates individuals to further hateful messaging. And not only did people stay moved, but they also moved other people in their households, which is amazing. So when you think about the ripple effect these conversations can have, it's really powerful. Another exciting piece of data is that this impact was essentially the same on voters of every race, gender, age, and political ideology. And this means that we really need to stop writing off people as immovable. So running a canvas, finding the right way to connect with voters is really important. So we need to find a value that elicits a story and a connection for the voter. So this is when testing different scripts on the doors, and this is a phase we call iteration, is really, really important. After canvassing for a month and testing over 25 different scripts and different values such as sacrifice, belonging, refuge, struggle, we arrived at the most successful theme of compassion. So this brings us back to the question we discussed just a few minutes ago. When was the time when someone showed you compassion when you really needed it? And this is what we asked voters to respond to. It was a breakthrough in our conversations. People really resonated with the idea that everyone should be treated with compassion. And we were really able to tap into their own experiences of when they needed and were shown compassion. So let's take a look at what deep canvassing or transformational conversations look like. Again, we're going to go through the deep canvassing script, but I'm going to talk about how these elements can apply to your day-to-day lives. The first thing is that we want to figure out how someone feels about a certain issue. And we do this by using a scale. You can see this on the screen. The scale is super helpful because people are rarely simply for or against something. They're usually somewhere on a spectrum. People's views are really complex. So if we're speaking to someone outside of deep canvassing, obviously you're not going to be walking around and showing them the scale, but you can use questions that get out at this complexity of feeling. So understanding that most people are not zeros or tens on the scale, right? A lot of people are in between. And we want to know how people really, really feel. I've mentioned this before, but otherwise we can't address their concerns and movement is unlikely. This is why a non-judgmental attitude is so important. There's an Unbound report that's really fascinating, and it reveals that one reason the immigrant rights movement struggles is that even though there are people who we think are with us, there are a lot of people that are not. So we assume people are with us that aren't. Even many liberal voters are not with us on immigration. And many times people live with their concerns and questions and never voice them, so they never become as supportive as they can be. We've got to really get those concerns out for someone to be able to move beyond them. After that, we're going to ask someone for their immigration story. So do you know anyone that's immigrated to the US? We might have to help them think through, coworker, friend. If they can't think of anybody, then we're going to ask their experience on immigration. So did they learn about it in school? Something like that, that just gets them talking about immigration. The purpose of sharing these stories is to tap into real lived emotional experiences. So we need to bring people to a place of emotion and help humanize these theories and policies. So how do we tell this type of story? How do we ask people to tell the story? We need to be an active part of the voter's story by asking good follow-up questions. These questions are so important. So we want to know how things felt, how people are doing. This helps us tap further into the real emotion of the story and helps us think through how something felt to another person. And then after that, the canvasser is going to share their immigration story, utilizing the same emotion and vulnerability. Then we move to the compassion story. So we want people to, how do we want people to be treated? When was a time when you needed support and someone showed you compassion? We want to know what it felt like to need that support and how it felt to receive compassion. We want to know if they received the support they needed. And we really want to be able to empathize with the voter's story, which again is why compassion is so powerful, because most people can really understand and agree that all people deserve compassion. So how do you elicit a good story? It takes practice. You have to go slow, listen for life experience rather than opinion, plan to ask a lot of follow-up questions, and be okay with silence when it's needed. And during the conversation, if you're ever unsure of where to go, ask more questions. Are you getting that questions are important? I tell my canvassers all the time, if you think you've asked enough questions, ask one more. So you should be deep into the conversation with someone before you ever make a statement. I know that feels weird, but you should be near the end of the conversation before you ever state a fact or share your opinion. It's all about questions. And then to share your own story, focus on the details and emotion of the experience. It doesn't have to be a big story as long as it's shared with honesty and vulnerability, and the story does not have to be perfect. So after sharing your stories, you finally arrive at a place where you can delve back into the concerns and make your case. So you get a sense of how people are thinking about their concerns in the beginning. Now that we've made an emotional connection, we're in a less reactive space. So you're able to address those concerns by asking more questions or by sharing one helpful fact. Don't go overboard with the facts, but you can share one here. And then we want to conclude by bringing things back to compassion. So you could say something like, I want my friend, whoever you talked about, and your friend, you would name the person the voter shared, to be treated with compassion. And again, I know that it's weird, but concluding statement is the first time that you have shared your opinion. And I know this is the opposite of how we normally have conversations. And that's why it takes practice. So the basic structure of the conversation is that you want to get all the concerns out in the beginning, put those current concerns on a shelf, walk away from them, let them stay there, and then enter into Storyland. And Storyland is where there are no facts, debates, or opinions. It's just story sharing. Then once you have shared those stories, you go back and take those concerns off the shelf, and then you get to address them. So right now, I'm really excited to introduce you to Will and Lizzie, who are two of our wonderful canvassers. And they're going to share a couple of stories about what it is like to have these conversations at the door and in their real lives. And they're going to share different examples of when a conversation produced movement and when it didn't, but what were the benefits of both of them. So I think we're going to have Will share first and then Lizzie. So Will, take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Will, and this conversation happened for me a couple of years ago, but we were talking to voters at the time about workplace raids and their feelings on workplace raids. And the voter I was talking to was an immigrant themselves. He had immigrated to the US about 15 years prior to our conversation. And he, in the course of the conversation, shared that he felt like he had navigated the immigration process, quote unquote, the right way. And so he, was not sympathetic at the time to undocumented immigrants who were being arrested and detained arrested at their places of work and detained then. And in his experience, he ran a team of folks in his business some of whom were undocumented immigrants themselves. And so he would try to give them advice, tell them to be smart. And if they got found out and detained, then in his mind, it was their fault that they just weren't smarter, or again, that they hadn't navigated the immigration process in the current legal structure. So, and in my talking with him, what we really ended up really being a conversation about values. And I also want to add a caveat before I go further to say where he ended up in the conversation was pretty atypical. But as we were talking about values and when people are struggling and how do we help people who are struggling, he was like, well, if I'm the only person showing up to support someone else who's struggling when there should be a whole group of people supporting that one person, why is that fair for me to provide all the support just by myself? And so then, when I shared my perspective, I shared it to me, it doesn't necessarily, we shouldn't necessarily rely on the people around us to dictate what our own personal values are going to be. And that sort of ended up being a really apparently significant mind shift for him. So Emily talked before about the 0 to 10 scale. He started that conversation as 0, really feeling unsympathetic, like I said, and kind of being in support of workplace raids. And he jumped to a 10 and really being against workplace raids. And so, I think for me, what I've just learned through these deep canvassing conversations and transformational conversations is sometimes people really, it's like they're just missing kind of one little piece, and they just need something to help reframe the ideas that they have in their head and really feel connected again to the values that they care about, that don't have to rely on the people around them.
Awesome, thank you, Will. We'll turn it over to Lizzie now.
All right, hi everybody. So Will has shared a story about a time that he was traditionally successful at the doors, but I'm going to share a story about a time that I was successful in a different kind of way. So as you guys have learned, we at Turk really love a scale. So I was speaking to a woman who was a 0, and she was just immovable. We were going through the script, we were sharing stories. She was, there with me. She was having the conversation, but she just wouldn't budge. And when I left, she was still a 0. And I remember walking back out to the end of her driveway and taking some notes, which is what I usually do between houses. And all of a sudden, the door was opening back up, and she was coming back out, and she was saying, "Thank you, Lizzie, thank you." And I remember coming back and sharing that at the debrief with everyone on the team. And we have this saying now that's, "Oh, well, you planted seeds." And so even if someone doesn't move, we really, really believe that having this kind of conversation changes something about this kind of conversation where you do really listen to somebody and you are really listened to is really sacred, I think. And so I think it's important to remember that you've planted seeds, whether you can see them growing on a scale or not.
Awesome. Thank you, Will and Lizzie. Yeah, just a reminder of different ways that these conversations can be successful. And just very grateful for Will and Lizzie's experience and their willingness to share a little bit of that tonight. So to conclude, I just wanted to share some key learnings from deep canvassing that I think can apply to the conversations that you're having in your own life. And then we're going to kind of talk about some things you could do moving forward. But this way of entering a conversation takes a lot of practice. It's not intuitive. I know a lot of deep canvassing principles seem straightforward, but when you think about how people usually have a conversation, it's not really natural. We are usually conditioned to think about how to best make our point or argue the facts. So being vulnerable and participating in true active listening does take practice. So I encourage you to practice it. Be easy on yourself as it becomes more natural. As our really experienced canvassers can tell you, that it will start to feel a lot more natural with time. The next thing is that whether a person moves has little to do with you. So I'd like to let y'all in on a little secret here. This is something that took me a while of canvassing for me to understand, but movement of voters actually has very little to do with you as a canvasser. And to be honest, that comes as a bit of a relief to me. It takes the pressure off. Your job is not to change the mind of the person you're speaking to. Your job is to be present, ask good questions, create moments of story sharing and empathy, and show active listening skills. Your job is to be willing to undergo and sit in the intimidating conversation and difficult moments with a non-anxious presence. And that's quite a job, right? That's not easy. But whether the person you're speaking to moves or not is up to them. The next really important point is that silence is okay. We often feel a need to fill the silence. I know that I do. But silence can give the person with whom you're speaking time to process. It's important to take a deep breath and let your question be followed with some silence. It will probably feel awkward, but that's okay. The conversation does not have to flow perfectly. The next thing is that this approach to transformational conversations is transformative for both parties. So canvassers often remark that the experience of these conversations has transformed them as well. It might be that they had a preconception of a voter that changed during the conversation, but if we want to change others, we have to be open to that transformation ourselves. The next thing is that facts alone don't work. I know I mentioned this earlier, but movement is more lasting if someone participates in their own movement. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes during deep canvassing, the voter ended up moving themselves just through being asked good questions. A lot of people don't take time to process what they fully think about issues, and when they're given that space, they talk themselves into a different viewpoint. So movement is more lasting when the voter is part of that process. This movement is more resilient to counter messaging and fear-based rhetoric. And then the last thing I want to leave you with is that we have to stop making assumptions about who is and isn't movable. Through deep canvassing, we've learned that few people are completely immovable, though this does happen, but most people are movable if given the right circumstances. So what is next? For our canvassing team, we just wrapped up phase 2 of our deep canvassing project, and the results are looking really good so far. We had to stop abruptly because of COVID-19 and a tornado that created a lot of damage in Middle Tennessee. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll start having deep canvassing conversations over the phone. So we're really excited to learn how these conversations transfer to phone calls and if they are as impactful as they are at the door. I want to mention that if you're interested in deep canvassing in your area, please feel free to reach out to me or the people at Indivisible. I used elements of the script in this presentation, but I would advise seeking some input on a full deep canvassing script and how to implement it and how to train deep canvassers prior to deciding to deep canvass in your own area. So I'd like to leave you with the following activity today. We'd love for you to practice transformational conversations by calling someone you know and think is conflicted on these issues. So I have a worksheet for you to think through how you're going to approach this conversation. I encourage you to fill out that worksheet, write down the personal stories you're going to share and the questions you want to ask, and practice it first with a supportive friend. Remember, when you're having these conversations, if things feel like they're getting off course, like you're going down rabbit holes, you can always bring it back to compassion. By saying something like, I'm not a policy expert, but I'm concerned with how people are treated in our communities. I want people in our state and country to be treated with compassion. So you can always, always, always bring it back to compassion. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Raquel.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for stepping in and sharing all those experiences. We only have a few minutes left, so unfortunately, we will not be able to answer questions, but type yes in the chat box. You can get the answers to the questions, all of the handouts, and the presentation that Emily was just referencing so that you guys can keep doing it too. And as we mentioned at the beginning, the fun continues with the first National Digital Rural Summit featuring rural powerhouses, ruralorganizing.org, People's Action, and the American Federation for Teachers. There is a link that we will drop into the chat box to register for the Rural Summit. We will also drop a few links for opportunities for y'all to really highlight the success of your groups. So there will be, we are having our first rural awards. So please nominate your Indivisible group. That link is dropped in there as well. It says Rory's Indivisible Rural Awards because it's cute. We also want to hear from you as rural organizers across the country. And so if you want to uplift your rural community, we have an opportunity for you to make a video using Soapbox to talk about all the awesome fun stuff you're doing. So that link is also going in the chat and will be in the follow-up email. Please create a video with your Indivisible group. And with that, thank you again so much for coming to the webinar. Thank you for those who, this is the first one. Thank you for folks who are there for the whole series. As a reminder, if you want a copy of this presentation, please write yes into the chat box. You will get every single thing that was referenced here, as well as everything you saw and answers to the questions we didn't have time to today, as well as all the links that I just mentioned about the Rural Summit and ways to highlight and celebrate rural groups and all the awesome work that y'all have been doing. And so without further ado, thank you so much to our guests from TIRC, the Tennessee Immigrants and Refugees Rights Coalition. Thank you so much to Afton and Carly, our wonderful tech person for today. Thank you so much to all of you. Please be safe, have a good night, wash your hands, don't touch your face, and take care of each other. We'll see you next time. at the Rural Summit is where we'll see you next. Bye-bye.